Yes, as Trey said, I am now at the Guardian Mobile Innovation Lab, but he invited me to talk about one of the last things I worked on the interactive news team at the Times, which was an election Slack bot. So I'm going to talk to you about its birth, its life, and its death. Basically, we'll get to that. So it started off actually as a conversation that we had with the R&D team at the Times, who had been doing a lot of research into group communication and how news could sort of fit into that world. And so we sort of came up with the idea of making an installable Slack bot that basically will bring election news coverage into your chat room. So we thought we'd start it nice and small scale, nice and quiet. We set it up in a way that some friends and sort of some colleagues could maybe install it and play around with it themselves and could get some sort of limited feedback. And then one of the designers at the Times found the entry in the CMS and tweeted it out. And we ended up with more like 450 people signed up for it, which was a lot more than we expected, which was quite intimidating. But if the designer ends up watching this video, I just want him to know I know it came from a great place, Alan. So anyway, he tweeted it out, and the Nieman Lab, who are here somewhere, discovered it, picked it up, wrote about it, and as I said, we ended up with a lot of people tuning in, and we had to work out what exactly we were then going to present these people with. So our first thought was that we would provide some live coverage on election primary nights. And basically just sort of this live stream of news and information as it comes through the newsroom. And we got to thinking of how we would go about actually setting that up on the back end. And actually, as Ben was saying, one of the beauties of Slack or chatbots in general is that they're very simple. It's very text-based. And so our first immediate thought was, well, why don't we use Slack as actually the admin that allows us to create the bot messages as well? So inside the New York Times Slack, we had a room dedicated to drafting out messages that we were going to send through the bot. So this was a really easy, really great way to work because it was this sort of collaborative thing where we could just get a bunch of people in a room and everyone could just start typing. Publishing messages was as simple as adding an emoji reaction to a message. It turned out that was maybe a little bit too easy to publish because that caused what I now refer to as the incident, where I accidentally sent a test message to around about 500 Slack rooms. Since then, we added a couple of extra security layers to make sure that doesn't happen again. But the general principle was still the same, that you add an emoji reaction to a message, and that then gets picked up by our backend, which then fires it off into everyone's Slack rooms. So you can see in this example here, these three messages have had the emoji reaction added to them. And then if we look at the actual output of the bot, you can see those three messages are now formatted, and that's how they were presented to anyone who had signed up for the bot. And you'll notice as well, of course, that this is posting as the bot. So it was myself and Michael Galwood, who works on the social media team at the Times, were drafting through some messages, but obviously we didn't want to send those as ourselves. But that wasn't always the case. So we actually had Paul Volpe, who's the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief on one of the primary nights, so that he could provide some live commentary as well. And we wanted to send things out actually with his name attached. So there's actually a slightly different emoji reaction. You can't really see it here. The colors are slightly different. But when you use that reaction, it would then get pushed through, and you see at the bottom here, with an actual attribution next to it. So we managed to be able to send through a mix of different things, some images, some text, and so on. And it worked okay. One of the real flaws in this is that most people use Slack at work. And most primary nights are, well, they're nights. So most of the audience wasn't necessarily using Slack at the time. They would have had to sort of go out of their usual pattern in order to be able to use it. So we got to thinking, in the spirit of experimentation, what could we pivot to next? And And we had this existing functionality we'd been using called Office Hours that is basically a live chat that runs on the Times website and has a form on the page for readers who are following along to be able to submit their own questions. And we thought, well, why don't we take one of these Office Hours chats and we'll sort of effectively like broadcast that through the Slack bot as well. So as you can see here, the top was the presentation on the website, and we pretty much did the exact same broadcast through of the live chat to everyone who was subscribed to the bot, which worked very well, except that there was one small problem. Well, not a small problem, was that there was a lot of it. It went on for an hour, and some users absolutely loved it, and they loved, sort of like reading along in their Slack rooms. Other users really hated it because it was very noisy, and this was sort of an important lesson that we realized that the Slack bot doesn't really have any clue about context. It can't read the messages that are in the room it's in, which obviously makes a lot of sense for like privacy reasons and so on. But it means you don't really have a sense of what's going on around you. Some people set the bot up to live inside its own room, and so they loved the live chat. It was perfect in there. Other people installed it in their general room, and they hated it. So that was a sort of interesting sort of mixed success. But one thing that worked out very well from it was that we installed a slash command, which is something that's available when you're making a Slack bot. You could just sort of fire off different custom commands. So we added one called Ask Nate, which was effectively a mirror of what was on the web, where there was a form where you could fill out a question and send it off. And people could ask Nate a question, and that worked fantastically. We got a number of really great questions in from people who were following along, and you can see an example there of, as a user, Mallory submitted the question. We then rebroadcasted that back out to all of the subscribers along with Nate's answer to Mallory's question. So we thought, given that sort of this asking a question model worked quite well, maybe there was something we could look into more there. And sat down again with the R&D team to look at doing some natural language processing in an attempt to automatically answer questions that people have about the election. And we ended up covering 2 areas in the experiment. One was candidate positions, and the other one was scheduling. So you can see these examples here of asking what is Bernie Sanders' position on guns, when was a New Hampshire primary, and those were automatically processed without us having to be involved. And setting that up was kind of an interesting new challenge. It's not something that we'd done before. We used a service called wit.ai, which is actually owned by Facebook now, but is a natural language processing service where you basically take whatever text someone has sent you, you send it over to them, and then they reply with this sort of structured data. But it does involve you setting up a lot of things beforehand. So you can see here in the WIT admin that we've got the various different entities that our bot was using. So we've got the topics for the candidate positions, the candidate names, states, parties, and events. So by sort of combining all of those together, you can see that this is basically how WIT worked. So as we fire in questions, it picks out the appropriate keywords and allows you to combine them as well. So you can say, like, when is the primary in New Hampshire? When is the next Democratic primary in New Hampshire? That kind of stuff. So we set it up, and for the first 5 minutes, it worked fantastically. And then we realized that once you allow people to ask questions, they really don't stop asking questions. And that becomes a problem because we can't really deal with, these are real questions, by the way. It becomes very open-ended because this sort of questioning, this chat interface is an extremely open-ended tool. And so if you have to tell people that they need to define their question in a certain way, then that's actually not really a very good user experience, really. So some of the questions that came through, though, were answerable. Say something about like donations. Now that's a data set that's out there in the same way that scheduling was out there. We could have added some functionality to be able to process that. That's fine. But a lot of the others weren't. A lot of them would require some really deep analysis, some of them even a subjective opinion. And some of them, like say the one there for the Minnesota Democratic caucuses, it's a fascinating question, but it's probably not one that's really going to scale. There won't be too many people asking that question. So even if we had an entire team of people working on this full time, you would probably still not be able to answer all the questions that people are asking. And again, given the open-ended nature of it, for instance, the question here of like, who is Obama's Supreme Court nominee going to be? Is that an election question? I mean, yes, it has an impact on the election, but it's not by and of itself an election question. But you could say, okay, no, we'll let that one go. We can answer that question. But then, inevitably, in the way sort of actual natural conversation flows, someone might then follow on from that and say, oh, well, who are the other potential nominees? And why is he... You know, and then before you know it, it's effectively you end up in this sort of... you're making a choose-your-own-adventure with infinite number of possibilities of choices. And everything will just sort of sprawl out very quickly. So after having seen that and thought about that a lot, we shut the bot down. Basically, I mean, it was only ever intended to be an experiment, and we realized that the resources that would be required to be able to actually provide the experience you would want from this bot would be extremely difficult. If anything, if there's anything to sort of take away from this, and this sort of, I think about this when I'm looking at all of the sort of Facebook Messenger bots and all of that stuff that's coming along. It's very, very difficult to make something like this really satisfying for a user. And you need to be very specific about the topic that you're doing it about. You need to sort of really narrow down on something where you can actually deal with a limited number of questions and so on. Otherwise, really, users are just sort of going to be a little thrown by the fact that they can ask one question and not another one. Working in news in many ways even makes it more difficult, because if you think about the way that say Apple works on Siri, they can keep adding on functionality over and over because they've got a set of functionality and they can finish it and it's done. We don't really have that luxury because by November all of the work we would have done in the election bot would be gone anyway, and we'd be back to square one. So it's a struggle because you're going to be constantly iterating on this sort of new stuff all the time. So, as I said, that was the end of the bot, but I was still optimistic. It was a really fascinating experiment, and we're hoping to be able to see where it goes next. Maybe something like the Olympics, who knows?